Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a phrase that seems pretty straightforward. You shall not bear false witness.
Right. The Ninth Commandment, most people probably think, don't lie in court, maybe don't gossip.
Exactly. But our source for this deep dive, the Kenosis channel's Biblical Humanities Lecture 31, it presents a really provocative take.
It really does. It suggests this commandment is way bigger than personal honesty. It's framed as this urgent, almost 4,000-year-old warning.
A warning against what, exactly?
Against a massive, long-running religious deception. Almost like the core message is, do not be deceived.
Wow. Okay, so not just don't lie, but don't be lied to, especially by religious systems. The source even talks about a 4,000-year history of spiritual fraud.
Yeah, it's a bold claim, and it connects to things like Jesus warning about false prophets. It hints this problem is ancient and deep-seated.
So let's dig into that. What is the actual nature of this deception according to the source? How does it define evil even?
Well, biblically speaking, the source argues that the essence of evil, what we might call the devil, isn't primarily about violence or causing physical harm.
That's interesting. We often associate evil with destruction.
Right. But this view sees that as secondary. The real root, the absolute core of evil, is presented as falsehood, deception, lying.
So if lying and deception are the ultimate evil,
then the very first principle for aligning with the divine, with truth, has to be not being deceived.
okay, so it's about understanding correctly, transmitting truth without twisting it.
Precisely. And that leads straight into the source's really challenging argument
Which is?
that a huge chunk of religious history, from ancient Israel all the way through the New Testament church and beyond, has basically been a history of people being deceived.
Deceived by who?
By their own religious leaders. The source almost calls it a history of fraud.
A history of fraud driven by spiritual leaders. That's quite an indictment. What's the evidence for that? Where does this view come from?
Well, the source points heavily to the Old Testament prophets, people like Jeremiah. Their main job wasn't just fortune-telling.
No, they were more like whistleblowers.
Exactly. They were constantly calling out the official religious establishment, the priests, the court prophets for their false teachings. Their cry was often, don't be deceived by these people.
Can you give an example? Like with Jeremiah.
Yeah, the temple example is powerful. People back then reviewed Solomon's temple. They thought, this is God's house. We're safe here. We're doing the right rituals.
The center of their religious life.
But Jeremiah comes along and says, essentially, this place you think is God's house, it's actually a den of robbers.
A den of robbers. That's harsh.
He even implies it's like a devil's den. Now, he wasn't necessarily saying the building itself was evil.
Okay. So what was the problem?
It was the message being preached there, the rituals that gave false assurance. They were offering this empty comfort, peace and safety, while the nation was morally bankrupt and heading for a disaster. They were bearing false witness.
So the leaders were actively misleading the people, blinding them within the holiest place.
That's the argument. And the source says this wasn't just a one-off problem in Jeremiah's time. It's a recurring theme.
It carried on into later periods.
Oh, absolutely. Look at the New Testament. Jesus himself, his harshest criticisms were often reserved for the religious establishment of his day, right?
Yeah, the scribes, the Pharisees.
He called them hypocrites, blind guides, false teachers. He accused them of shutting the kingdom of heaven in people's faces. It's the same pattern of deception from the top.
And then moving forward in history. The source points to the medieval period too, I believe.
Definitely. The sale of indulgences is maybe the most infamous example.
Right, paying money to get forgiveness or reduce time in purgatory.
Exactly. It's presented as this enormous, great fraud of the era, a blatant deception, really, making people think they could buy salvation. It was spiritual falsehood used for, financial and political gain.
Were there other examples from that time?
Yes, the source also mentions things like the witch hunts, the use of torture in the name of orthodoxy, even the immense resources poured into building magnificent cathedrals.
Wait, the cathedrals? Like St. Peter's Basilica? How are they part of this?
Well, the argument isn't that beauty itself is bad, but that these grand structures, often funded through questionable means like indulgence sales, stand as historical monuments to a period of deep religious corruption and deception.
Wow.
The source provocatively suggests that visiting some of these European cathedrals could, from this critical viewpoint, feel like a tour of the devil's den, seeing the power and wealth built on potentially misguiding the faithful.
Hearing all that history, Jeremiah, Jesus, the Middle Ages, it makes something very common today seem, well, Incredibly ironic.
Where it's at.
The casual way people still talk about temple construction, fundraising campaigns to build new church buildings often use that exact phrase, "유정견자."
Ah, yes. That's a really sharp observation.
Given the historical critique of the original temple as a potential den of robbers, using that term today,
Yeah.
it feels jarring, doesn't it?
It highlights what the source calls extreme ignorance, actually. A profound lack of awareness about the Bible's own internal critiques and the historical baggage that terms like temple carry, especially when all this information is readily available.
It's not just about not knowing the history, though.
Yeah.
The source talks about how insidious this kind of deception is. It's not always obvious.
No, it's incredibly subtle. That's the danger. It's described as a kind of double blindness.
Double blindness. How so?
Well, first, the people doing the deceiving often genuinely believe they're right. They think they're speaking God's truth, doing God's work. They're blind to their own falsehood.
Okay, that's one side.
And the other side is the people being deceived. They often have absolutely no clue. They think they're enlightened, following the true path, receiving genuine spiritual guidance. They're blind to the deception they're caught in.
So both the deceiver and the deceived can be utterly convinced they're in the right.
Exactly. And the source calls this level of unawareness extreme ignorance, with potentially terrible consequences because nobody realizes there's a problem.
And this isn't just a problem within, say, Christian history, is it?
Not at all. The source is clear. This is a human problem. Across cultures, across history, you see examples of religious figures or systems using false teachings or leveraging power to manipulate and exploit people.
Even today.
Yeah.
In our supposedly rational scientific age.
Think about it. We still see widespread belief in superstitions, right? People checking lucky days to move house, relying on fortune tellers. You even see highly educated people sometimes getting deeply involved in shamanism or cult-like groups.
That's true.
And sociologically, while religion is often supposed to be society's moral compass, that last bastion of truth, history often shows it siding with power structures or, unfortunately, becoming a vehicle for deception itself. It's a recurring tension.
It makes you wonder about the personal cost. What happens when someone deeply invested in one of these systems starts to realize they might have been, well, deceived?
There's a really moving story shared in the source material about someone like that. A person raised Christian, a cradle believer.
Okay.
They were taught very diligently, especially through sermons, that if they practiced their faith correctly, crucially, including tithing, God would bless them materially. It was presented as almost a transaction.
A common teaching in some circles, definitely.
Yeah.
So what happened?
Well, they followed it closely. They tithed consistently. But when they went out into the real world, life didn't match the sermons.
The promised blessings didn't show up?
Not only did they not show up, but this person struggled financially and personally while seeing people who weren't religious, who didn't tithe, seem to prosper.
That must have caused a huge internal conflict.
Huge, profound confusion, then a feeling of betrayal. It led to rebellion, questioning everything they'd been taught, even turning to alcohol to cope with the disillusionment.
Did they find any answers? Maybe in seminary, you mentioned?
They tried. They went to seminary looking for solutions, but the standard curriculum didn't address this core dissonance they felt. No answers there.
So where did the breakthrough come from?
It was actually a chance encounter, totally outside of seminary. They read a book that just clicked. It laid out this idea of historical religious deception.
That resonated.
Deeply. The realization hit them. They felt they had been, in their words, brainwashed by years of sermons focusing on those transactional promises. That shocking insight was what finally ended their long period of wandering and confusion. It brought clarity.
Wow, that's powerful. And that personal story kind of mirrors a bigger historical pattern, doesn't it? You mentioned Renaissance figures like Erasmus earlier.
Exactly. Humanists like Erasmus looked back at the medieval church, saw the corruption, the contradictions, the sale of indulgences, and they diagnosed the root cause.
What did they identify?
Ignorance. Specifically the ignorance of the lay people, the congregation, who just blindly followed whatever the clergy told them. They saw that unquestioning acceptance as the fundamental problem enabling the whole corrupt system.
So their solution wasn't just to reform the clergy.
No, it was more radical for the time. Their solution was to empower the believers themselves by encouraging them to become knowledgeable, to read the Bible for themselves in their own languages, to study theology, to think critically, essentially, not just rely passively on what they were fed from the pulpit.
So education and personal understanding as the antidote to deception.
Precisely. And what's fascinating is that this revolutionary idea actually connects way back to the original spirit of the Old Testament law, even the book of Leviticus.
Leviticus.
Yeah.
Really. Most people think of it as just a dense list of priestly rules.
Right, but the source argues it wasn't only for the priests, it was also a detailed guide given to the people
For what purpose?
so they could understand the rules themselves, monitor the priests, and hold them accountable. It was designed to prevent the priests from manipulating the system or deceiving the populace.
Like a system of checks and balances built right into the law.
Kind of, yeah. Parents were supposed to teach these covenants to their children. It was meant to create an informed, discerning community that couldn't easily be fooled.
That puts a whole different light on it.
It does, and it makes the modern casual use of temple construction, as you pointed out, seem even more detached from that original critical spirit embedded right there in the scriptures. It's a historical amnesia almost.
Okay, so if this pattern of deception is so historical, so subtle, and the antidote involves personal understanding,
hmm
what does that mean for us, for you listening today? How do we avoid falling into these traps?
Well, the core message from the source is about taking personal responsibility for your understanding.
Meaning?
Meaning you can't just passively accept what you're told even by trusted leaders. You have to do the work yourself. Delve into the scriptures, study history, engage critically with ideas. That's the aim of approaches like biblical humanities, for instance, to foster that critical engagement.
So individual effort is key. What about within religious communities themselves?
There's absolutely a need for internal reform, the source suggests. More critical thinking among theologians and pastors themselves, and fostering a culture where questioning and critical consciousness among lay people are seen as healthy, not threatening.
That brings us to potentially tricky concepts like orthodoxy and dogma. How do they fit in?
Dogma refers to those officially defined, fixed doctrines, often presented as non-negotiable. Orthodoxy is, holding the correct beliefs.
Which sounds good in theory, protecting the truth.
In theory, yes. But the source issues a very stark warning based on history. How often has the label orthodox been used?
To condemn people.
Exactly. To label the actual truth-tellers as heretics. Think about it. The prophets were often seen as rebels against the established religious views of their time. Jesus absolutely was condemned by the Orthodox leaders. Reformers throughout history faced persecution, even death, for challenging the prevailing dogma.
So the very mechanism designed to preserve truth was often used to attack it. Jesus was a victim of orthodoxy.
That's the tragic irony. And the takeaway is crucial. We should never grant unconditional, unquestioning authority to something just because it's labeled orthodox. History teaches us to be wary.
This leads to a really mind-bending paradox the source raises, especially relevant today.
Which one?
In our age of information overload, many of us feel quite knowledgeable, quite certain about our beliefs. We think we're too smart, too informed to be easily deceived. We might even feel a sense of absolute certainty.
Ah, yes, that sense of certainty.
But the source flips this completely on its head.
It does. It argues that this very feeling of absolute certainty, especially in religious matters like having complete assurance of salvation with no room for doubt, might not be a sign of strong faith.
Instead,
Ironically, it could be the strongest indicator that you're caught in the most subtle, most dangerous kind of deception.
how can certainty be a sign of deception? That seems counterintuitive.
Because true faith, the source suggests, isn't about arriving at a place of static, unshakable certainty. It's an ongoing journey. It involves humility, self-reflection, constant striving, questioning, being open to deeper understanding.
Like the Apostle Paul, maybe? Even he talked about disciplining himself, fearing being disqualified. He didn't seem to rest in absolute certainty.
Precisely. That kind of absolute closed-off certainty where you think you have all the answers and no longer need to question or learn. That, the source warns, can be dangerously close to complacency, even a kind of devil's faith, a faith that's resistant to actual truth because it's so sure of itself.
Okay, let's try to pull this all together then. The Ninth Commandment, you shall not bear false witness. If it's not just don't tell lies, what is its deepest meaning, according to this interpretation?
It's fundamentally about tackling falsehood at its root. Simply commanding people don't lie doesn't stop lies, does it? Lies work because people believe them.
Right. Deception needs a receptive audience.
Think about the analogy used. CCTV cameras. They reduce theft or hit and runs Not because people suddenly become morally perfect overnight.
No, it's because the chance of getting caught goes way up.
Exactly. The deception involved in getting away with it becomes much harder. The lie loses its power when exposure is likely.
So applying that to the commandment.
The deeper meaning becomes, do not be deceived. Because if people refuse to be deceived, if they become discerning and critical, then falsehoods, lies, and bearing false witness, they just lose their power. They can't take root.
That puts a lot of responsibility on the listener, not just the speaker.
Absolutely. It's a shared responsibility. Deception isn't solely the fault of the preacher or leader who might be misleading people, intentionally or not. It's also the responsibility of those who listen uncritically, who follow blindly without engaging their own judgment. We all have a duty to discern.
So ultimately, in matters of faith and truth, what's most important is it zeal, good intentions.
According to this perspective, what's paramount is a correct understanding. Understanding the Bible critically, understanding history, understanding humanity, the world. That foundation is crucial.
More important than just being enthusiastic or seemingly virtuous.
Yes, because without that correct understanding, even with the best intentions, we're likely to repeat the devastating errors of the past, like the Dark Ages, like the situations the prophets railed against, or fall prey to the subtle deceptions operating today. Correct understanding is presented as the key to freedom and the path to a truly authentic faith.
This has been a really challenging but fascinating deep dive. We started with don't bear false witness and ended up exploring millennia of potential religious deception, the danger of ignorance, the power of personal understanding, and the perils of false certainty.
It definitely reframes the commandment. It's not just a simple ethical rule, but potentially a deep existential warning.
So as we wrap up, maybe a final thought for you, our listener, to take away and wrestle with, building on what we've discussed.
Here's something to consider. That feeling of absolute certainty you might have about a particular truth, a belief, maybe even your own salvation. Is that feeling truly the sign of a solid, unshakable, healthy faith?
Or could it, paradoxically, be an indication that you might be caught in the most clever, most insidious form of deception, the deception of unquestioning certainty itself?
It's a challenging question, but one worth pondering deeply.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the Ninth Commandment and the complex history of truth and deception. We hope it's given you plenty to think about.